everyone. Thanks so much for joining. I know we're still having some folks hop onto the meeting, but for the sake of time, I'll get started. Really excited to kick off this webinar. So thank you so much for joining us, especially during your lunchtime. We really appreciate it. And we hope that this will be an engaging discussion. So the topic that we're going to be presenting on today is going to be the transition from your early feasibility study to your pivotal study for implanted BCI devices. We have a great set of panelists that are going to talk to you about patient perspectives. We're also going to give some regulatory and reimbursement perspectives. So next slide, please. So the webinar is being hosted by MCRA. I know many of you guys already work with us, but for folks who don't know about us, we are a global CRO and advisory firm. We have a really strong regulatory, international and US space. A lot of the folks here are former FDA members. We also have a terrific reimbursement and market access team and a really in-depth specialty in running clinical trials for neuro devices. So hopefully we'll have a chance to work with you in the future if we haven't had a chance yet. Next slide, please. So MCRA offers a number of services, far too many to really list on one slide, but these are some that are applicable to BCI devices in general. So we have obviously the CRO, we have regulatory team, quality, healthcare. We also have a cybersecurity team. My colleague, Alex Cadotte, who'll present later, leads the AI Imaging Center. And we will also be hearing from John Schmitt from our reimbursement and market access group. So next slide, please. So some logistics. If you have a question, please feel free to use the QA function located at the bar at the top of the webinar screen to put those questions in. You can put your questions into the chat. We will be addressing questions at the end of all the panel presentations. So as soon as you have a question, feel free to put them in. We will definitely try to get to all of them toward the end of the presentation. There will also be a recording as well as the slides for the webinar will be provided to registered participants. And if you guys have any questions or you want to reach out to MCRA in general, feel free to use the email address info@mcra.com to reach out to us. And yeah, we hope to hear from you. Next slide. So before we dive into our presentation, I do want to make sure we have the same scope of what we're considering BCI interfaces. So we borrow the scope from the FDA BCI guidance, which are BCI devices being neuroprosthetic devices that interface with both the central and the peripheral nervous system to replace lost motor or sensory function in individuals with paralysis and or amputation. Next slide, please. So with regard to our presenters, we have a guest speaker, Ian Burkhart, who's going to be joining us. He is the founder and president of the BCI Pioneers Coalition. Ian is going to be speaking to us about some of the patient perspectives that can model how the product is being adopted. My name is Devjani Saha. I will be presenting to you on the regulatory side of how to kind of think about it from the FDA perspective. My colleague, Alex Cadotte, who's the vice president of our Digital Health and AI Imaging Center, he will be presenting the predetermined change control plan and how to think about that for these devices. And finally, we're going to end with my colleague, John Schmitt, who is the associate director from our reimbursement team, and he's going to be talking to you about some of the reimbursement implications. Next slide, please. So with regard to the agenda, as I mentioned, we're going to be going through some short presentations. If you have any questions, please go ahead and put it in the chat or the QA function. And then we really set aside a bit of time at the end to go through questions from the audience. So we hope that this is an interactive discussion. So with that, next slide. I will pass it over to Ian to talk about patient adoption considerations.
Thank you so much, Devjani. Hi, everyone. My name is Ian Burkhart, and like Devjani said, I am the one of the founders of the BCI Pioneers Coalition. If we go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit of how I got to where we're at. I had a spinal cord injury when I was 19 years old that left me as a complete C5 quadriplegic, unable to move anything from my shoulders down. I could move my arms around a little bit, but with very minimal coordination. And at that point in my life, I went through traditional rehabilitation and I wasn't really satisfied with my level of independence. I wanted to be able to do much more for myself. And that led me to look at clinical trials for someone in my situation. And I was lucky enough that there was one taking place in my hometown, about 25 minutes away from where I was living at the time, that was using a brain-computer interface to control muscle stimulation on my forearm, as you can see there in this picture on the right. When I would think about moving different parts of my hands, the system would tell a external muscle stimulator to actually have my muscles fire. And that was something that was very exciting to me. I'll go in a little bit further about how I was able to use that. But if we go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit more about what can be done with BCIs. It's been used previously to allow people to communicate, whether that be with a computer, controlling a virtual keyboard, or imagine handwriting movement, controlling robotic limbs, implanted muscle stimulation, surface muscle stimulation like I was using, and then also just more natural ways of interfacing with their general technology that they use in their day-to-day life. It's something that, really allows people to increase that sense of independence. Next slide. So some of the patient adoption considerations that I think are very important is weighing that surgical risk versus the device benefits. Right now, all of these are done within the clinical trial realm, but we're getting very close to expanding on that and allowing these devices to be used as a clinical tool. And that's something that both the patient and user and their care provider needs to weigh in on and make sure it's going to fit their life and that they have something that can work really well for them. Another thing that's really important is the calibration of the algorithms. A lot of times in the lab, when I was using these devices and others that have used research tools, they're really set up for specific experiments versus set up for a ongoing day-to-day operation. It's not something that you can just turn on and go, but that needs to be done before it's something that you can use at home and not have a team of PhDs behind you ready to step in and adjust something. Additionally, we need to make sure that there's a balance between regulation on the software and hardware with how much needs to be reviewed for incremental changes along the way. Next slide. As I mentioned earlier, I created the BCI Pioneers Coalition to really help share the experiences of individuals who have been able to participate in clinical trials. Here's 6 individuals that are a part of our coalition, as well as more. And we try to make sure that we can highlight everyone's viewpoints because while there now have been roughly 67 individuals who have participated in clinical trials for brain-computer interfaces, it's still a really unique experience, and those are still really low numbers compared to the amount of people that can benefit from this technology in the long run. Next slide. With that being said, we really like to make sure that we can highlight our experiences as much as possible and get out there. So a couple of these photos are from the Society for Neuroscience annual meeting. And we get out to different conferences and try to share our experiences to make sure that the design considerations of those who are going to be using the device are considered at every step of the way, as well as making sure that people can really be interested in the overall use case of these technologies. Next slide. One thing that's really interesting, especially now, is there's a lot of talk with AI and machine learning, and the balance of that between the data collection and privacy. And I think it's really something that is interesting based on whatever kind of stakeholder group you're in, and also your own personal perspectives on BCI technology. A lot of these devices really have the opportunity to provide people with so much independence and so much autonomy that you are giving up some privacy, but you're actually gaining more privacy in some examples. There are ways that people can then use these devices to communicate without having to speak through another person. That allows them to be more independent, which is great, but we also need to make sure we're balancing and making sure that the data that is collected is only the data that's necessary and it's always being used in the right way. Next slide. Another potential important consideration is what happens if you're looking at a permanent implant or a device that's supposed to last, 10 years longer. You don't want to subject individuals to multiple surgeries for replacements of consumables, whether that be a battery or even just a upgrade. You also want to make sure that these devices have a good balance between how much risk is given with the potential surgery and then the reward and the outcome of being able to use this device and be independent. Next slide here, quickly to finish. It's really important to balance all of these endpoints for quality of life. These devices really have a huge opportunity to improve the quality of life of people with disabilities, allow them to be able to do things independently. And while there are risks, there's a lot of dignity in that risk of being allowed to choose these solutions. And there's going to be multiple solutions in the future that some will work better for some people in their own risk kind of paradigms that they have, and some will work better for others. And it's something that we need to just make sure that everyone is considered, and then we can highlight all those opportunities for people so they can make the best informed decision. But with that, I will pass it along to Devjani to look at about how we can get from clinical trials out.
Thanks so much,
you.
Ian. Thanks, Ian. So I'm going to be talking about the neuroregulatory perspectives on transitioning from EFS to pivotal. Next slide, please. So before I do, I did want to give you guys some background. So I am one of the directors here at Neuroregulatory Affairs at MCRA. I've been at MCRA for almost 3 years now. Prior to that, I was with the FDA for over 6 years, primarily working with neuro devices and phys devices. I was heavily involved in drafting the BCI guidance that's been published by FDA. I was also an early feasibility lead for the neuro office at FDA for over 5 years. I have a broad range of expertise, including BCI, neurobotics, and neuromodulation. And while at the FDA, I was also part of the clinical trials team, as well as a real-world evidence policy analyst. So next slide, please. So before we get started, I do want to talk to you guys about the different types of clinical studies. So you have your EFS studies, or early feasibility, you have your traditional feasibility, and you have your pivotal study. The unique thing about EFS is that there is a opportunity to start a clinical study when your device design isn't final. So what you're telling the FDA in certain cases is that, FDA, my device is at prototype stage, but I really can't continue to develop this device anymore. I'm at a stage where I am trying to collect, and so I need some clinical data in order to continue developing of my device, right? So the purpose of the study is really to guide device modifications. It's to collect some preliminary safety and effectiveness data. You may be honing in on your intended use population. trying to understand what type of endpoints you can move the needle on. The device risks sometimes aren't well understood. It could be a really novel device. And because of that, FDA is really careful in the number of subjects that can be approved for implantation. So you're looking at up to 10, sometimes 15. When you get to your traditional feasibility, this is a period where you really have a near final device. And the purpose of the study is to collect safety and effectiveness data, but you're really trying to hash out your clinical study design and trying to understand the statistical considerations. You're basically de-risking your device, right? You're just de-risking your trial to make sure that you can move the needle on your endpoints, and you have designed a study that is going to lead to some clinically meaningful effects. And for that, you need some additional subjects. So you're looking at somewhere, greater than 15 subjects, but maybe up to 50. It just depends on your indications and what you hope to do with your feasibility study. For the pivotal study, you're lacking in your device design. You're really trying not to touch that. And that's because you're trying to demonstrate safety and effectiveness, right? You're trying to collect that data on your final finished device in order to demonstrate safety and effectiveness. This is your validation study. And the subject number really depends on your indication and your sample size. So, conventionally, you're looking at scenario 1. Teresa, if you can press enter. So it can go from EFS to traditional feasibility to the pivotal. So that's typically how it's been done. But for the BCI realm, you may be considering scenario 2, which would go from EFS straight to pivotal. And that consideration really deals with how much you have already learned in your EFS, how confident you are about your clinical trial design, about your recruitment capabilities, retention capabilities, your site investigators, how much you've vetted it. If you can do a lot of this in the EFS, you can definitely go straight to your pivotal design. And if we have time at the end, we can talk about when is a good time to think about that hop. Next slide, please. So if you're in a, once you start thinking about your pivotal study, you're going to want to ask the question, okay, how do I get started designing a study that the FDA is going to be okay with, right? And this is something that we recommend to our clients. Start off with a synopsis. Don't dive right into writing a detailed protocol. Start off with the main points about your clinical trial. Including endpoints, statistical considerations, your inclusion-exclusion criteria, and go through this guidance document. It's the benefit risk guidance determination document that's published by FDA, and it really highlights what are some of the considerations that FDA makes when they're looking at clinical evidence in order to determine whether it's suitable for approval in a marketing submission, right? So next slide, please. This guidance document is broken up into 3 sections: your assessment of benefit, your assessment of risk, and then putting it together, the assessment of benefit or risk. And each of those sections are divided into different questions. So for the benefit section, you have the first question is evidence of clinical benefit. You don't have the data, understandably, but you would have had to model, you would have had to identify your primary effectiveness endpoint and put together statistical sample size considerations. So based on that, you can model your clinical benefit based on your primary effectiveness endpoint. And then you need to dive into the uncertainty and the benefits. And what that means is really looking at your clinical trial design. What are some of the uncertainties? Perhaps you have a single arm trial. Do you have sufficient justification to convince the FDA that there is no placebo effect? Have you considered confounding factors? Have you taken that into consideration either in your eligibility criteria or as a statistical analysis? Have you also thought about your success criteria? What is going to determine whether your study is successful? And often that relies on some established minimally clinically important difference or performance goals. And unfortunately, in the PCI space, there's really a lack of established MCID and performance goal. And do you have enough evidence then, given what's out there in the literature, kind of what you see and have been hearing from patients and caregivers as what is considered clinically meaningful, right? That's going to be really important, that you have enough evidence to demonstrate whatever that benefit is clinically meaningful to the FDA. And then when you go to the assessment of risk, it's a very similar outline in that you need to identify the risk, especially ones that are more than minimal. And you can also look at the uncertainty in your risk, right? So do you have sufficient sample size in order to detect a serious adverse event? Do you have enough data on repeated exposure to your device, as well as, how does confounding factors color what you see in terms of the risk presentation? And finally, bringing that all together in your risk-benefit assessment, right? Does the benefits outweigh the risk, given everything that you know about the uncertainty of your benefits and your risk? And then also taking into consideration some additional factors, such as what Ian has spoken to in terms of the patient perspective in accepting some of this uncertainty in the risk as well as the benefit, as well as perspectives from clinicians and providers. And for BCI, there's often a strong factor of an unmet need that you can fold into your discussion. So our recommendation is start with this early. Don't keep it till the end of the study. Start with it early so you have everything built in, and then start having that discussion with the FDA in terms of your benefit risk plan and discussion. So next slide, please. So with that, I pass it over to Alex to talk about the predetermined change control plan.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining the webinar. I'm here to speak a little bit more about the overlap between predetermined change control plans and BCI. Next slide, please. Just a little bit on my background. Devjani and I have both been here with MCRA for about 3 years. And I also worked at the agency for 6 years, most recently as the team lead for imaging software. When I was at the agency, I worked on things like the predetermined change control guidance document. I also worked as part of digital health on the pre-cert program. And I also, interestingly enough, have prior research during my PhD and postdoc on BCI, brain mapping, epilepsy, and electrophysiology. So I also have expertise in 510K, Q-subs, breakthroughs, and de novos at FDA. And along with the 3 years that I've been here, and probably where I get most of my questions and expertise is the validation of AI machine learning devices. Next slide, please. So kind of getting right into the meat of the background for the predetermined change control plan. Basically, the story is here, starting from last year, Congress has passed a law, which essentially means that the predetermined change control is part of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act at this point. So it is something that is allowed by law as opposed to by guidance. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail here for this. Let's go to the next slide. So FDA's draft guidance for PCCP lays out some really specific things. Some of them is basically, with the guidance that's out there, this guidance is very much applicable to machine learning device software functions. However, as I mentioned earlier, predetermined change control plan is part of law, so it's actually much broader than that, which I'll touch on in just a few minutes. But the guidance itself, it talks about what things should be included as part of your marketing submission. Also, it's really important to note that PCCP is optional within a marketing submission. So it's not like you have to include these in the submission, but when you do, it's very important that you draw specific attention to this in your cover letter and various other parts of the submission, so FDA knows that they are looking at a predetermined change control plan. And that can be part of a 510K, a de novo, or a PMA. And another very important thing here with the draft guidance, and hopefully with the eventual final guidance, is that a lot of these PCCP policies are intended to harmonize with existing current modification documents. So, if your changes that you're looking to do are things that are already allowed by FDA, you don't need a PCCP. This kind of fits in that gap of things that FDA typically would want to see a 510K for, but FDA may authorize them as part of a PCCP, so you don't necessarily have to come back to FDA specifically for those items. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, the PCCP scope is broad. Right now, the guidance that's out there is very much focused on AI machine learning, but generally speaking, there's a lot of conversation in the space about PCCPs being used for things like biocompatibility, improvement in diagnostic tests in general, not just AI machine learning, reporting real world evidence and performance, in kind of in support of health equity. And one area that was recently highlighted at the MedCon conference is that, things that are usually governed by standards where the testing is very well known, but the FDA still reviews it as part of a submission. These are areas that are really ripe for FDA to approve a PCCP for as part of your regulatory submission. And generally speaking, they're also useful for expanding interoperability and compatibility. Next slide, please. So just some of the types of questions that you may run into with FDA, and I'll just hit kind of the high points here, is that the level of detail is usually one of the biggest concerns with these types of submissions where a PCCP is included. One of the first red flags for me quite often looking at drafts of PCCPs is that, if you're talking about, 5 to 10 pages of work that you put in there, it's likely not going to be enough for FDA because they're looking for a very high level of detail in terms of not only what the scope of the changes that you're looking to make, but also how you plan on implementing. And they really are looking for the level of detail down to the work instructions and possibly SOPs that you're using as part of this process. Another point that should be hit on here is, are the modifications that you're proposing specific enough? And that applies to the protocol as well. So, generally speaking, a PCCP is not a wide open door for you to do anything with. Typically, the types of things that you would propose here are very specific. And there are boundary conditions related to the use of your PCCP. At most, I would think that you might save 2 to 3 510Ks out of a PCCP, but they're not necessarily meant to be something that would keep your device from needing a 510K in perpetuity. And kind of the final piece for a PCCP is the impact assessment. Just like any other parts of the device that you're including, these future changes that you're making should be evaluated from a risk-benefit perspective. And a very important point here is making sure that as you make these changes to your device, that the expectation is that you're conserving the intended use of your device. This is not a mechanism by which you would add on functionality in a way that would change the intended use of the device. Next slide, please. So finally, getting to the main point of this discussion is, how can a PCCP be used for BCI? Well, as I mentioned earlier, these PCCPs can be very broad, and there's a lot of opportunity out there to basically try new approaches for using predetermined changes as part of a BCI implementation. Some of the most obvious are perhaps improving the performance of any algorithms or performance of the device over time. These are probably covered by the existing draft guidance. More specifically, when we're talking about calibration and modifications of algorithms to fit a wider range of patients or adapt to the needs of the patients, if you're conserving the intended use, there may be some leeway in here to use a predetermined change control plan to kind of broaden the types of patients and the scope of the algorithms that you might be clearing as part of your submission. The other thing that could be considered here is adding new outputs that could either be fed into or out of the BCI implant that help the device keep pace with consumer electronics. It's all well and good that these devices allow additional communication and interaction with the outside world, but if you're limited to technology from 8 years ago, it can severely kind of make your experience not as good as it could be. So being able to keep pace with the pace of modern consumer electronics and apps and various things so that basically people can live a normal digital life. Also, there's a lot of talk about using this for, when you do your initial clearance for a device, it might be for a single platform. However, the PCCP could be used as a means to expanding to new platforms. If you started on iOS and you want to expand to Android or other operating systems that might be on basically consumer electronic devices that you're looking to control, this may be a means to bridge that gap over time without necessarily having to come back to FDA. And lastly, just one area that might make sense is plan modifications to the hardware that would help keep the device within this idea of the reasonable assurance of cybersecurity. For example, as Wi-Fi chips change over time and new protocols are developed, it may make sense to make these changes to the system so that the device is able to remain cyber secure. And these are things that are fairly straightforward and could be governed by pretty straightforward SOPs and work instructions that would allow changes to the hardware platform to keep the device more relevant and cyber secure over time. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to John Schmitt, and thanks for your time.
Thank you, Alex. Hello, I'm John Schmitt, Associate Director of Health Economics, Reimbursement, Market Access at MCRA. I've been here for just over a year. Next slide, please. My background is from around the commercial sides of healthcare. On the provider side, I was commercializing remote diagnostics and digital health products and services at Mayo Clinic. On the payer side, I worked in corporate strategy at Blue Cross Blue Shield Association. And along the way, I've supported a few startups in a health economics and VC funding support role. At MCRA, I worked primarily with clients on reimbursement and commercialization strategy assessments. So that's everything from standard coding coverage and payment work to VC financial modeling or commercial strategies. Next slide, please. So when people think about reimbursement, the focus is often on you got to get a code and a proper payment assignment. But coverage is often kind of an afterthought. In reality, it's probably the most important piece. So you can actually get reimbursed without a code and assigned payment. It's not great for general adoption, but it's certainly possible. However, especially in this space with the high cost, coverage can really be a complete showstopper. So if you're able to dual purpose a pivotal trial with additional endpoints or economic or quality of life endpoints, or maybe at least you have a post-market evidence plan in place, by thinking about coverage now, early on in the process, as you're going through the FDA requirements, obviously that can make the evidence process more efficient if you're able to do dual purpose studies. But really what you're saving yourself is the possibility of years of revenue delays or slow growth after you're on market. Next slide, please. One other reason you really need to plan ahead and think about coverage and payer evidence separately is that payers have additional criteria for coverage beyond what the FDA demands for safe and effectiveness. So Medicare uses the reasonable and necessary standard or appropriateness, and you need evidence showing it's on par with current standards of care. Commercial payers have even more scrutiny, where you really have to show that your device improves net health outcomes in a real world setting, not just in an investigational setting. Next slide, please. So here we're going to take a quick look at some new high-tech computerized ankle braces and exoskeletons, some coverage for that. While brain-computer interfaces obviously are not the same thing as that, it's a great real-world example that really highlights similar payer coverage scrutiny that BCIs are going to face. So focus on a couple things here. This is an evidence statement describing, the justification for why microprocessor orthoses are not covered in this scenario. One of the things is surrogate outcomes, and you can think of it as lab-based metrics in controlled environments. In a brace setting, it would be a patient can apply this much force at an angle, or pick up a glass, or type at this speed. And that's not typically sufficient, especially in this space, to achieve payer coverage. You really need real world evidence. So thinking about it, translating it to BCIs for something that aids with communication, you could think about, is the patient able to call 911 on their own? And that reducing the need for 24/7 caregiving. Is the patient able to perform activities of daily living? The other thing is you're going to be compared to the standard of care. For a lot of novel devices, it's a challenge because there aren't specific scales or scores to compare it to. I will say that the quality of life endpoints here are typically considered secondary endpoints in more traditional therapy areas, but here they're going to be given a ton of weight and they're going to be critical. One other thing to address here, a question we get a lot is, can you model or reason your way to those outcomes? Based on your impact to the patient, is it self-evident that the real-world outcome is going to be there? Typically, when there's incremental improvements in care or less differentiated devices, it's possible that payers will take that. But with novel devices, well into the 6 figures minimum of cost, payers will not take those benefits as self-evident or reasoned. You will need to demonstrate them in your studies. Next slide, please. So here, shifting from clinical to the economics. The early BCIs, are very focused on patients with extremely debilitating problems. And I imagine everyone here who is working on a BCI, you probably have a societal burden of illness model. And that model makes the economic and societal value of your device obvious. The problem here is that doesn't address the fact that there's divided incentives across the different stakeholders. So, those that in theory would foot the bill for this device, payers often, are typically the gatekeepers to medical decision making. And many of the societal benefits that you're relying on for that are not, the payers typically are not the ones who receive those financial benefits. So a couple examples, if you're thinking about commercial payers, if one of their members or former members, whatever, is on disability for 2 years, even if you're under 65, you can qualify for Medicare, and then you're off their books. So as you're thinking about coverage, you also have to consider utilization management and where you put your priorities. Can payers deny the treatment or the device, but also can they delay it? And when you shift towards Medicare, right, even within the different levels of government, there's kind of an incentives mismatch. First, on the traditional benefit plans, Medicare and Medicaid, a lot of the custodial care is not covered. So things that you would normally think of as treating activities of daily living and non-skilled nursing caregivers. Those costs and where the savings would occur are typically borne by long-term care insurance, workman's comp, and then also Medicaid waiver programs is a huge source of that. And so you're stuck pulling the cost from the Medicare budget there, and the savings will occur, even within government on Medicare waivers. So when you're thinking about your regulatory and legislative engagement efforts, as an industry as a whole, this should be a critical focus area. It's not an unsolvable problem. There are precedents here. It will probably require legislative and regulatory engagement. But if you look towards history and precedents, in the past, Medicare has carved out specific benefits in an exact same sort of situation with end-stage renal disease. So there are examples where this is certainly an achievable problem for the industry. But in the meantime, what does that mean for you? It's mostly a segmentation exercise. So look for specific areas and populations where these stakeholders do have a broader purview of these incentives. The obvious example would be probably the VA, if you're looking at devices that are supporting amputees, traumatic brain injury, depression, but also you can look towards employer groups with a high percentage of specific workplace injury, and perhaps they see downstream value on their workman's comp, or it's sort of a recruiting tool. Often medical benefit decisions are meant to really improve employee morale, whether or not they're used specifically medically that often. That is all I have, so I think I'm passing it back. And we have time for questions.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it, John. So we'll open the floor up to questions. So again, feel free to use the Q&A or the chat function if you have any questions that you want to discuss. I think we have 2 that came in so far. The first one, it's from Andres. He's asking about endpoints for quality of life. I think Ian presented a slide on that. And the question is whether it's been formalized with FDA or CMS, and if there's any, concurrence yet from the FDA on BCI endpoints. So I can start off, and then I'll call on some other folks to kind of weigh in on this topic. So with regard to the FDA, they haven't published anything that really shows, okay, we agree with these endpoints. And I think the FDA is, they are also trying to work with sponsors in order to get to the right endpoints. And there's a number of reasons. There's a variety of indications. You're looking at a variety of patient population. So I think FDA is also kind of at that point, along with a lot of sponsors, trying to vet out what are appropriate endpoints. And it's really up to sponsors to make a really strong justification for the endpoints that you choose. Having said that, I think quality of life is going to be an important consideration. While I don't know if it's going to be your primary effectiveness endpoint, so when you think about the primary effectiveness endpoint, you really want to think about your indications for use. So let's say the indication for use is speech generation, or moving a cursor on a screen, or controlling some robotic end effector. That indication, your primary effectiveness endpoint has to support that. And then secondary endpoints of quality of life is going to definitely play a part in the totality of evidence. But I think for the FDA, that primary effectiveness endpoint may be related to your indication, something closer to accuracy. And then obviously the secondary endpoints will need to be statistically powered as well. So with that, I will also ask, John, can you also speak to CMS and their considerations for the quality of life? And then I'll hop over to Ian with regard to the patient adoption.
Sure. So the specifics from a CMS perspective on quality of life, they're very therapy focused. So for right now, MedCAC, the Medicare Evidence and Coverage Advisory Committee, they're meeting on specific quality of life endpoints for diabetes self-management and continuous glucose monitors. So exactly what sort of surveys and questionnaires they would like to see, scales, that sort of stuff. So I think as this area grows, you might see some similar specific guidance here. I think my recommendation in the meantime, as you're trying to design your studies, is look at the standards of care that you're going to be compared against by payers. Look at the evidence that is being cited, and whether it was viewed favorably, whether those endpoints were utilized positively or negatively, and let that guide you, because when it comes down to it, you're going to be compared to the standard of care.
And Ian, can you speak to kind of, what are some of the things that maybe patients and caregivers are looking for patient adoption when it's, a quality of life considerations? Like, what are some of the, how important are these endpoints for adoption?
Yeah, it's something that's really interesting as we look into how these devices are going to get funded and by what groups they can get funded through. I see a large potential in state vocational rehabilitation programs for allowing people to get back into work with the device. Also, if you can reduce caregiver hours directly, that can help the bottom line there. But I think the first devices that are going to be approved and paid for are going to be for communication. Those ones are a little bit more cleanly aligned with existing parameters on what can be funded for. for assisted technology, but it is something that we have to make sure that the incentives are aligned across all stakeholder groups to make sure that these devices can actually get out to the people who need them the most.
Great, thanks you guys. I think another question that we got in was if, and Alex, I'll look to you to address this, and happy to hop on. If you could elaborate on how PCCP applies to post-market data, specifically with reporting on health equity.
Yeah, so this is actually kind of an area of interest for me, and there's a couple pieces here that would contribute to this. One of the things that often happens in a pre-market submission is that, for example, for an AI machine learning device, you're providing a body of evidence and a body of testing that, one of FDA's concerns is that it is the testing is done on a data set or a group of people that is representative of the US population. Anyone knows that when you're talking with clinical trials, even especially with things like BCI, you may just have to, you basically get what you get from the trial because number one, there's a limited number of subjects out there, and you can exhaustively search to increase the diversity of your group. But there's often challenges in any clinical study of providing that balanced data set. And even when you get into larger numbers of 100 or 1,000 participants in a study, it's still a little bit difficult to abstract that to the entire US population. So part of what you're starting to see from FDA, and I'll get to the PCC bit in just a moment, is that they're looking to shift a lot of the burden from the pre-market to the post-market, where the device is used to kind of understand how these devices work for the US population. So one of the things you're starting to see in recent de novos in this space and others is basically one of the controls is having a plan for a plan for post-market monitoring of your device and how it's performing in the field. So the general idea here would be that if you were going to propose a PCCP to address health equity, it may push some of the burden from kind of upfront demonstrating that the device generalizes across the US population, and really starts to make it so that your PCCP combined with your post-market monitoring plan, you'd be able to understand how this device is actually performing on different populations. And the important thing is that it would give you the ability to update your labeling for the device as you become more familiar with how it works across parts of the population. In some circumstances, a device may not work quite as well on one subpopulation versus another. And a lot of times what needs to be understood about these things is the transparency about that performance. So that's kind of part of shifting that burden from the pre-market to the post-market, which, in the end, we think is the more appropriate means of ensuring health equity is when that device is actually being used on a wider population and the company is monitoring its performance out in the wild and, being very transparent about, where that device works, where it generalizes well, and potentially situations where it does not perform quite as well. So I hope that answers the question.
Great, thanks so much. I think we also have a question for Ian. Ian, how can we mitigate patients' fears, given that the device is connected to the outside world and overall cybersecurity risk? Do you have any recommendations with regard to that?
Yeah, one of the most important recommendations that we can impose is that everything is spelled out clearly to the patient that's going to be using the device, and it's not a nice long terms of service that everyone clicks agree to when they sign up for any other online service that we already give up a lot of privacy for. And also how much can be done on device versus needs to be sent out to the cloud to be analyzed or to an external server. I think that's really important. But at the same time, it is really that individual benefit risk calculation of how much am I okay with allowing someone to see with the intended benefit of being able to use the device and be a little bit more independent. We all every day give up a lot of privacy just to use different online tools. So I think it's just another one of those that we have to consider. But if we can just make sure that everything is spelled out as straightforward as possible so that everyone's making an informed decision, I think that's the best practice, as well as, just eliminating the amount of data and only requiring what's necessary unless it's something where you're wanting to share that data to help with future development.
Thanks so much, Ian. So hopping over to our next question, I think this one was for me in terms of what is FDA looking for when determining whether the traditional feasibility step can be skipped, right? And so with regard to that question, FDA never, there's no rule, there's no mandate that you have to do a traditional feasibility study, right? But what FDA is really looking at, well, one important consideration for IDE is that for an IDE to be approved, FDA can only look at safety considerations. They're not looking at effectiveness. You might get study design considerations, but your approval of your IDE is really based on safety. So the number one question that FDA is asking is, okay, this group has done an early feasibility study. They have 10 subjects. Do I feel comfortable enough with their safety data that I will allow a much larger study, right? So that is the main question that FDA is looking at when they're looking to approve whether you can start a pivotal trial. Now, for a pivotal trial, you're going to have to put together your statistical analysis plan. But like I said, FDA can't disapprove you because you chose a wrong endpoint. They're going to put it together in your study risk or study design considerations, right? But for you as a sponsor, what you want to make sure for the feasibility study, when you decide whether you want to do this or not, is do you have enough of the risks kind of de-risked, right? So do you know what your endpoints are? Do you know what kind of clinical trial design you should be getting? Are you going to be able to move the needle on your endpoints and your success criteria? So all of the things that we kind of talked about. Do you have a good idea of your site recruitments? So the feasibility study is really a de-risking strategy, but often in PCI, if you think about your pivotal study and what we just talked about endpoints, if your primary effectiveness endpoint, if it shows a really large effect size, like the person wasn't able to have any speech and now we're giving speech generation, I mean, it's a pretty dramatic change. You can be thinking about a smaller patient population, but so sometimes that feasibility study doesn't make sense, right? So a small feasibility study with a small pivotal study, it may not make sense for you. But again, that feasibility study is really to de-risk your clinical study design considerations. So hopefully that helps. So for the next question, I think there was a question for John. What are your perspectives on US versus global reimbursement of BCI devices, and what are the implications from a market access strategy?
So, I'm definitely not an expert on the specifics of international reimbursement payment systems, the specifics. So just thinking through this broadly, kind of want to jump back to the point I made about distributed incentives, right? In the US, it's very challenging. The entitlement programs, the disability programs, employer-based healthcare, the incentives are spread around so much that it takes a lot of change to be able to make this economically feasible. So in a lot of other healthcare systems, there might be where there's a lot more centralization. I'm thinking about NHS in the UK. There may be a lot more direct benefits in one organization where the cost is, and then the same organization can realize, societal benefits and productivity benefits of someone instead of being on a disability payment, they're actually, paying taxes and all of that. So I think if you combine that with just the overall, GDP of different markets and a willingness to pay on healthcare. And then you also have to think about, technical infrastructure and ability to support those devices. I think just looking, it's a similar segmentation exercise as you do in the US, where you're looking for pockets where the incentives align. But, it's a little bit more probably broad country to country.
Thanks so much, John. And I think this is going to be our final question. So the question that we have is really, instead of submitting a 510K for a peripheral device, so there are peripheral devices that we can think about, not a PMA, but a 510K, possibly a de novo. The question is, could I leverage the PCCP avenue for a device that's cleared through an IDE supplement for a PMA? So I think if I understand correctly, the question is if you wanted it, in what instances can you really leverage the PCCP if you are thinking about changes to your marketing submission, whether it's in a PMA or in a 510K? Alex, can you respond to that?
So I think the important thing to realize here is that the PCCP mechanism is actually part of the clearance that you would receive for a 510K, granting of a de novo or approval of a PMA. So it's actually part of that regulatory submission. If you decided that you wanted to modify your PCCP for something new, you would actually have to resubmit or do a supplement to your PMA to modify that PCCP. That being said, the PCCP is really intended to be kind of its own thing, meaning that, like, if you're going to add a new peripheral device, I'm just assuming here that peripheral device, what we're talking about here is more about the communications with that. I don't want to conflate here with the idea of a medical device versus kind of like an iPad or various other consumer electronic device. But in that case of adding kind of a new consumer electronic interface to a brain-computer interface, I would think that you could, when you got that PCCP approved as part of your PMA or your 510K or perhaps your de novo, it would be self-contained in the sense that it would contain all the things that you would be doing to validate that consumer electronics device or perhaps other medical device, I could think of some circumstances where that might apply, would be compatible with your system and that you're validating along all the lines where FDA would normally pay attention to during that regulatory interaction. The general idea here is that you're putting the procedures and process in place with very strict predetermined endpoints about what success looks like for adding that peripheral device to your system. And then when you go through all of those things verbatim as you listed them in your PCCP, then you're clear to basically provide that functionality to your users. So I hope that kind of explains a little bit more about how that mechanism could be used to add a peripheral device, and that for the most part, it's intended to be kind of a self-contained piece that wouldn't necessarily relate one regulatory submission to another, but perhaps more about making sure that this new peripheral device interacts with the subject device in a way that FDA would say is safe and effective.
Thanks so much, Alex. Appreciate it. So I think just to end it here, we are at the top of the hour. Thank you so much for your time. This is great. And I hope we can do future webinars with you on this topic of BCI. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to continue to engage with you all. And for our next webinar, MCRA will be hosting, it will be on reimbursement considerations and product commercialization, and that will be on June 11th. So hopefully you can join that. So thank you again. Have a great rest of the afternoon, and we'll end it here. Out.